So, good evening. I'm Metta Spencer here in Toronto, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting conversation with Catherine Abreu, who is in Halifax.
Yeah.
And we've just been setting up our equipment here and getting acquainted a little bit. Catherine is the executive director of the Climate Action Network, which is a large organization of Canadian, I guess they're all Canadian, organizations working on climate change, as the title implies. So Catherine is in Halifax this week, following a ministers' meeting for the G7. And she was bringing me up to date about the kinds of things that they do. So I'm looking forward to this little conversation, and I hope we all get more educated about climate affairs. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Metta. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Okay, so let's get started here by doing a little bit of history of your organization. I just found out that Maurice Strong was one of the main instigators of the organization. Is that right? Tell us about how the Climate Action Network came into being.
For sure. So although I wasn't around, so I can't actually say this for sure, but I don't think Maurice Strong himself started Climate Action Network, but his actions definitely led to the beginnings of the organization. So about 30 years ago, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary in 2019. A bunch of Canadian advocates, so activists that had been working on environmental issues for a long time, and many of whom continue to work on environmental issues in Canada, got together because there was this thing happening in the international realm to get a bunch of countries together to talk about the potential for an international treaty to address climate change. And Maurice Strong was really one of the instigators of that. So he was the person responsible for starting the environment program at the United Nations. And he later on went on to be one of the main advocates for and founders of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which brought a bunch of countries together, all the countries in the world, to have a conversation about climate change, and eventually led to the signing of the Kyoto Protocol, which you may have heard of in 1992, the first international treaty on climate change. So those are where the beginnings are, really, in Canadian civil society wanting to be a part of this pretty incredible moment in Canadian history where Canadian politicians under a PC government, I might add, it was Brian Mulroney, who was the prime minister at the time, was leading the charge in the world to get folks talking about climate change and confronting this emerging crisis. Climate Action Network Canada, which is the organization I run, was therefore one of the first climate action networks in the world. There's now an international body called Climate Action Network that operates in about 120 countries worldwide and has 1,200 members globally. So we in Canada have 118 members, but I have a bunch of colleagues all around the world who are working as well. So it's got a really proud history and really strong Canadian roots.
Mm-hmm. Well, now is Canadian and are the Climate Action Network Canada part of Climate Action Network World?
Yeah, indeed. So it's interesting because Climate Action Network International was born out of the national nodes. So there was Climate Action Network Canada, and then eventually there was a Climate Action Network in the United States and Latin America. And at some point in the early 2000s, these national nodes realized that it would be helpful to have an international body to help coordinate their activities. And that's when Climate Action Network International was born. And so is really this kind of bottom-up organization where it's the members and then the regional and national nodes and then the international body who drive the agenda of the organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you say something about, or maybe it's not polite to ask this, but I was just wondering,
Go for it.
Areas of the world that are more enthusiastic and committed to working on climate issues than other areas. And maybe you're not supposed to say bad things about your partners overseas, but I'm curious.
Are you asking from the perspective of civil society, general public, government? What level are you thinking about?
I think of, well, I didn't have it very well formulated in my own mind. I'm just thinking back to a time, something like maybe 10, 12 years ago, when I was spending time in Russia quite a bit, and talking to people there and finding that at that point, public awareness about even the fact that there was global warming was much weaker than here. I remember being at a dinner table and the topic came up, and I gave a whole impromptu lecture to the whole people, everybody there, because nobody had ever heard of it before. Now, I don't think that's the case anymore. And it may have been connected to the fact that Russia was a great oil exporting country, and maybe the government simply didn't want people to be discussing this. But even, I remember going to Greenpeace, and they were doing a lot of good environmental things, but at that point, they were not really working on climate change. So here I am plunging into a fraught area, if you don't mind mentioning your own impressions of this.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's my impression, having only ever worked in Canada, I should say, that in terms of civil society capacity to organize around the issue of climate change, Europe and North America, and increasingly actually South Asia, have a leg up. So there is a tremendous amount of capacity in the United States especially, but also in Canada, in Western European countries, mostly those belonging to the European Union. And now there's a very, very strong South Asian Climate Action Network that operates regionally and has a huge amount of members who are very active and engaged.
In India, when you say South Asia, you mean mostly India or around Indonesia, wherever?
Yeah, so there are two regional nodes. There's a South Asian node, which is based in India, but covers other close by countries such as Nepal. And then there's actually a Southeast Asian Climate Action Network as well. And they coordinate activities in some of the more eastern parts of the region. So yeah, so some great capacity there. There's also amazing work that I know my colleagues undertake in Eastern European countries, in Latin America, in China and Russia and Japan. It is my impression that there's less capacity in those regions at the civil society scale, not just on climate change, but in general. And I don't want to say too much about why that may be, but I think it's a combination of social factors. So just a different history of civic engagement in those countries, as well as political factors, a government that just isn't maybe supportive of civil society action.
Well, that's what I would imagine. Everything would depend on whether or not your government would encourage civil society organizations or try to stomp on them.
Totally.
Tell me of the situation in China in that regard, because my impression is that civil society is you're walking on eggs, whether or not you're going to get in trouble for whatever you do. Is that, or do you have that kind of contact to be able to say about China?
Yeah, again, it's so hard to speak for someone else's experience because I've never worked there myself. But I have a handful of colleagues who are doing incredible work in China. And I have the impression that they are able to maintain a fairly open dialogue with the current administration about climate and environment issues. That all being said, so, this is where, taking it to that kind of broader perspective on the ways in which civil society is treated writ large is important, because right now China does have an administration that is relatively amenable to conversations about an action on climate change and some other environmental issues. I would guess that there are some other progressive social issues that folks working in China have a much harder time working on.
Yeah, human rights.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's why, that's in part why there's this move in the climate movement. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that later, toward climate justice, of saying our struggle is not disconnected from other struggles for equity and social justice in the world. And when we live in a space where human rights defenders of any stripe, whether they're defending humans' rights to a healthy environment or defending humans' rights to decent work, that those struggles are common struggles.
Okay, well, let's not dodge that. May as well talk about it now. No agenda here.
Great.
But also connect that to another issue that I've heard people say, that the less developed countries are more reluctant to, or feel that for the sake of justice, that the real burden of the economic burden of transition should be borne predominantly, if not almost entirely, by the rich countries, because the rich countries have made the mess in the first place. We ought to clean it up and not hold the poor countries to the same standards of self-restraint and austerity and energy conservation. That we shouldn't all have a universal set of rules about how much we can emit, but we should let the poorer countries emit more, just to be fair. I don't know whether I'm representing that point of view accurately, but is that a real debate, or is that just something I've heard people talk about?
Getting right into the juicy stuff. I love it. It is a very real debate. Yes. So there is this understanding that there are countries in the world, we're sitting in one of them right now, who bear a much larger historical responsibility for climate change than other countries. And of course, those countries that bear a larger historical responsibility are those that have already gone through industrialization, because industrialization was generally predicated on the ability to exploit, extract, and burn up fossil fuels to produce large amounts of cheap energy. And so we now in Canada and the United States and most Western European countries sit in the incredible privilege and benefit that those industrial and wealth that those decades of industrialization born on the back of fossil fuel extraction have given us. And of course, there are many countries in the world that have not yet gone through their own process of industrialization, or, now that we're kind of in a different era, some other model of large scale economic development that results in citizens having access to a much broader, denser variety of services than they might have otherwise had access to. And one of those services is electricity, something that many of us in the Western world or the Northern world or the developed world, so whatever phrase you want to use, really take for granted. So India has millions of people who don't currently have access to electricity, who have never had access to electricity. And India sits there saying, what? I mean, you're telling us that we can't build a coal plant to produce electricity to service this community that has never had access to this thing that you all in Canada take for granted? That's not fair. And that makes a lot of sense. really. And so the way that has been dealt with in the past in the international climate regime is through this concept of common but differentiated responsibility.
Say it again.
Which
common
but differentiated responsibility. CBDR.
Something like separate but equal schools, but go on.
Interesting. CBDR is one of the founding principles of international climate relations, and also one of the many bits of jargon in my toolkit of acronyms. And CBDR, it says, this is a common fight. We're all in it together, but we all bear different responsibilities for the problem, and therefore maybe we all have different things to do about the problem. The way that showed up in the Kyoto Protocol is through these annexes that separated countries into Annex A countries and Annex B countries. So countries that were basically the developed countries that were called on to legally commit to emissions reductions targets that were binding, and Annex 2 or Annex B countries who were largely developing nations who did not have to sign on to those legally binding targets. And
Annex B is the developing or developed?
Yes, developing.
Developing, yeah. All right.
So it was really only developed countries that that were brought into the legally binding emissions reductions targets set out in the Kyoto Protocol. And that, as you might imagine, created quite a lot of controversy. Mm-hmm. It was something that the countries agreed to. At first, it took quite a while for the Kyoto Protocol to actually come into effect. And when we went through this era where countries were questioning their commitments to the international climate regime, it was that piece that actually gave a lot of developed nations a kind of excuse to get out of it. So you've heard the United States actually continue to say this even today. Why do we have to do everything if emissions are growing much faster in China than they are in the United States, and China isn't forced to commit to this legally binding emissions reduction target? Why do we have to do all the work?
So China still isn't.
Okay. So here's the thing, is everything changed in 2015 with the signing of the Paris Agreement. We still have this idea of common but differentiated responsibility. So it's still acknowledged that we're in this common fight together, but we all bear different, and when I say we, I mean different countries, we all bear different responsibility for the problem. And therefore, we must all develop our own approaches to addressing the problem. But what the Paris Agreement did is called on every single nation, every signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, to come to the table in 2015 in Paris and say, this is what we're willing to do. That totally changed the game. So for 25 years, over 25 years, really, since 1992 with the signing of the Kyoto Agreement, or the Kyoto Protocol, I should say, we had this situation where it was developed countries being locked into these emissions reductions targets, and developing countries doing their part, playing their role, but not within that legally binding framework. Paris Agreement said, actually, everyone's got a job to do, and we're inviting countries to come to the table saying what they're prepared to do. So now we have a situation where every country that is a signatory to the Paris Agreement has something called a nationally determined contribution, an NDC. And that is that is the emissions reduction goal and the kind of climate action package that they have said that they're contributing to the Paris Agreement goals of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius while striving to limit it to 1.5 degrees by 2030.
Okay, can a country count doing things like planting trees? can something that is short of reducing emissions, but which makes a difference in global warming in terms of greenhouse gas levels, does that count as a contribution?
So the short answer is probably. The long answer is that depends on the rules that are set out to determine the ways in which the Paris Agreement functions and how countries will account for and report on their emissions reductions activities in the framework of the Paris Agreement. So if I can unpack that very long answer for you a little bit.
Please, I need help.
In 2015, we signed, we got the gavel that brought the Paris Agreement into the world. That was a really historic moment. And then less than a year later, in 2016, the Paris Agreement went into effect. It was the fastest ratification of an international treaty of any kind in history, which still gives me goosebumps to say. And it really, from my perspective, captured this incredible moment of global consensus on the urgency of climate change and a willingness to take action on it. Mm-hmm. But because it was ratified faster than any other international treaty, parties and their negotiators had far less time than they were anticipating to set out the rules by which the Paris Agreement would actually work. So for every international treaty, you know, there's this document that says, we understand all this stuff is happening and here's all this stuff that we're planning to do about it. But then there has to be like a working program that tells parties to that agreement and also the rest of the world how those parties are actually going to do what they say they're going to do. And then how they're going to prove they're doing it and how they're going to keep doing it into the future and make sure they keep doing it better. Mm-hmm. So we still don't have those rules for the Paris Agreement. Mm. And whether counting the planting of trees and how to count the planting of trees and who gets to and who might not and where the trees are planted, all that jazz gets sorted out in those rules.
Mm. Okay, well, that's a bit discouraging, isn't it? Because I was going to ask an even tougher question, which would be something like, what kind of enforcement mechanism or penalties if a country doesn't live up to its obligations? But that already presupposes we know what the obligations are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
a little obscure as to whether or not that's so clear in there.
Yeah. So there was a deadline of this year actually put in place to finish the rule book for the Paris Agreement. And so parties right now are just like scrambling to the finish line of the next big UN climate change conference. One happens every year, and the next one happens in December in Poland. It's called COP24. Whether we'll actually be able to see that rule book by the end of COP24, we're not sure yet. Some progress is being made in some areas. Some progress is not being made in others. It's uneven. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And then how countries are held to account is a good question. So one of the big criticisms of the Paris Agreement is it's not legally binding. Mm-hmm. But that being said, the Kyoto Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol was legally binding technically, but did it actually punish those countries like Canada that withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol and refused to do what they said they were going to do under it? Not really. Mm-hmm. So what the Paris Agreement has set up is kind of this like grand exercise in peer pressure.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Which is interesting. It's
kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
Shame on you if you don't do your part. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Well, is there even a mechanism for, I mean, will people be in a position to say shame on you? Will the results be calculable and publicized, will we know whether or not we're living up to our agreements, much less whether Paraguay is living up to its agreements?
Yes. So that's something that Kyoto did really well. It established a very regular reporting mechanism. And all countries to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change report regularly every couple of years on their emissions reductions actions.
Okay, they may be reporting on what they've done, but how do we know whether it's working? In other words, the amount of emissions coming out of Canada compared to the amount of emissions coming out of, Australia, how do we know?
Yeah.
CO2 molecule.
Yeah, if only every one of them had a tag and we could track them across the world. So the body that, well, I should say that there are a bunch of organizations that do that kind of work, but really the body that's most responsible for it and provides the analysis that most of the world looks to answer those questions is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Have you heard of them, the IPCC?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I've even met a few of them.
Well, there you go. Halifax kicks off a month of travel for me, and a part of that is going to an IPCC conference, a big deal IPCC conference that happens the week after next.
Oh yeah, where's that?
That's happening in Seoul, in South Korea, which is very exciting. I've never been.
Okay.
So I'll actually tell you why I'm going there in a minute. So the IPCC is a scientific body. However, they do not do primary science. It's the IPCC's job to collect the primary scientific work happening in the laboratories and field labs all across the world, being done by thousands and thousands of the world's best thinkers, and to collect that into summary reports that give us this picture of what we know about climate change. And that picture includes impacts from certain levels of warming to terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems, you name it. So they talk about impacts, but they also talk about the carbon budget. So they give us this snapshot of how much room there is basically in the atmosphere to emit greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, but there are also, of course, as you know, other greenhouse gases like methane. So how much room there is in the global atmosphere to emit greenhouse gases before we reach certain levels of dangerous warming. Mm-hmm. And it's within that carbon budget that that one can calculate the impact of the relative contributions of parties to the UNFCCC. Mm-hmm. So what's about to happen, actually, in a couple of weeks, is we're going to get a new carbon budget, because the Paris Agreement did a bunch of stuff that was unprecedented in the realm of international climate treaties. One of the things it did was it brought every country into the world of setting climate plans and climate targets. But another thing it did was it added a goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So previously, I'm sure you've known this for a long time, the goal was to limit warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Mm-hmm. That goal remains in the text of the Paris Agreement, but in addition, parties agreed to strive to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the reason for that is that 0.5 degree difference makes or breaks the ability of many of the world's most vulnerable nations to survive in a warming world. It's that 0.5.
I didn't get all of that.
Yeah.
That last sentence.
Yeah. So it's that 0.5 degree difference that can make or break a very vulnerable nation's ability to survive in a warming world. So it can be that 0.5 degrees that determines whether an island nation can adapt to the impacts of climate change that it is experiencing, or has to evacuate and allow their home to be swallowed by the ocean. And it's actually the world's most vulnerable nations that fought for the inclusion of that 1.5 degree goal in the Paris Agreement. And it was a huge battle in Paris. And Canada, Minister McKenna, our environment and climate change minister, showed up in Paris like 3 weeks into her job, barely knowing where she was, I think. She was so exhausted. And she played a really pivotal role in getting that 1.5 degrees commitment in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, I'm glad. Good for her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now let me go back to this tricky one that I alluded to, which is what happens if a country doesn't comply? I guess on the one hand, they could withdraw, as indeed the U.S. is going to do. But if they don't withdraw, is there any penalty for failing to achieve the stated goals?
Nothing as concrete as, I mean, I don't really know what an example would be, but nothing that's satisfyingly vengeful. So, no.
Yeah. My punitive mind wants to go out and do something horrible to people who flagrantly violate the things that we need to have to accomplish.
I agree. Yeah, I feel you.
But that's not going to happen. All right.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think I know that maybe we'll get around to talking about what you're there to watch in Halifax, the ministers, the G7 thing, but just from where you sit in the room watching these guys perform and dodge and weave about their obligations if they do, what is your impression about how seriously most countries are really committed to trying to fulfill their obligations?
I would say most countries are genuinely committed to fulfilling their obligations. And the extent to which countries are willing to inconvenience themselves and or either actually or perceive to threaten their economic productivity by taking action. So the extent to which countries are willing to do those things varies dramatically. So yes, so within this genuine commitment to action that I think most countries do hold, there are some countries that are so committed to action that they will risk injuring their GDP, at least in the short term. And there are some countries that will only do whatever they can do before they potentially risk injuring their GDP. And of course, whether that risk to growth and economic prosperity actually exists, even when governments perceive that risk, is questionable, because there are a lot of very powerful entrenched interests who benefit from perpetuating the myth that economic prosperity and growth will be hindered if a country doesn't maintain the status quo.
Mm-hmm. And do you hear those guys? Do they come and make noise?
All the time.
They do.
Oh,
so in other words, the civil society people, the good guys who show up like yourself, you're not the only ones. There are some bad guys who show up too, and cause trouble.
Yeah, I mean, whether they cause trouble is, I think, maybe a matter of opinion and perception. Because of course for some, their mere presence is causing trouble. And then others say, well, all stakeholder engagement in this process is necessary. And in order to do what we need to do about climate change, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room, which is the fossil fuel industry. And so they might as well be here. So it depends on kind of where you sit within that spectrum. There's definitely a big effort. There's a big civil society effort to kick all fossil fuel industry interests out of the UNFCCC negotiations. Folks who argue that, it is similar to inviting the tobacco industry into an international negotiation around cancer research, avoidance, and treatment. And then there are some who say, well, if we're going to manage the decline of these industries and get them to use their very powerful resources to help us in the transition, then we need to let them into the conversation.
Do you have a position of your own on this?
Oh, Metta, that's such a tricky one. Yeah, so I'm kind of two minds. I actually really see that point, that having fossil fuel industry interests at the negotiations is a conflict of interest. I see that point and I empathize with it. I think, when we're in a space where we should feel comfortable having a conversation about setting targets, for instance. So, something an international climate agreement has never done is set a target for reducing the production of fossil fuels in the world. So we've set targets for reducing emissions, but we've never set targets for actually cutting how much oil is being pulled out of the ground. And that's kind of crazy that we've never talked about those supply side elements that we need to be working on. We've only really talked about the demand side elements. So making more fuel efficient cars, well, let's get rid of the fuel in the first place. So the fact that we are in a space where I think the presence of fossil fuel industries helps to hinder that kind of conversation is problematic. So yeah, I think I would agree they shouldn't be at the UNFCCC, but I also have some empathy for the idea that they should be involved in the conversation more broadly. And I think there are other spaces where they can be in that conversation.
How do they show up? Is there a guy with a little pin saying that he's representing Shell Oil? Or is there a guy with a pin saying he represents the Association of Fossil Fuel Producers in the World, or something like equivalent?
Both, definitely both. Okay. Yeah. And then there are the people who wear no pins at all.
And you have to guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you find out? Do you go out for drinks with these guys and ascertain where their loyalties lie?
I don't know if I go out for drinks with them. I might lose some friends if I did that. But definitely, there's not a lot of secrets at the UNFCCC. I mean, people aren't there in hiding. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of specific, policy changes or interventions or elements that I would like to see in agreements that, as I understand it, have not been. As a peace activist, my main concern.
Yeah, I'd be so interested in hearing your perspective.
That weapons, I mean, if you just building tanks or bazookas or airplanes or, boots for guys to put on the ground, all of these things require the emission of greenhouse gases. And running the tanks around in practice also emits stuff, and flying airplanes. And then if you have a war, there's a lot of emissions that go on out there. And then you've got to rebuild the cities, and that takes some emissions. So we've got a hell of a lot of CO2 being produced by military activities. And I would love to see a recommendation or requirement in one of these treaties that every country in the world should have to reduce their military by 80%. And this would make a big difference. Now, I don't know that we've been able to calculate how much of the CO2 in the atmosphere comes from military activities and what percentage of it comes from civilian activities. I'd love to see that calculation.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Now tell me, as I understand it, in the Kyoto Accord, the military component of a country's budget, CO2 budget, if that's what it's called, I think it's not, but something like that, that the military component was not counted. That, you know, you count everything else, but then you have the right to emit as much CO2 as you want. But I understand also that when it came to the Paris Agreement, that it's a little better, but they don't have any mechanism for tracing it or something like that. Can you set me straight on what that is and whether to try to say that, damn it, the military counts too, and we don't care whether a particular molecule came out of a tank or out of a car. We don't want them to come out.
Yeah. I have to admit to you that I had never thought about this before. So thank you for bringing this into my brain. It's a new thing to mull over. So definitely no, there's not a category within the emissions reporting function of the UNFCCC for military emissions. That's true. Definitely any emissions related to military activity that were happening domestically would be captured by the domestic reporting. But here's the tricky part, and this is common for a number of industries, not just the military, where there are emissions that cross national borders, those accounting rules go out the window. So an example is international aviation.
Oh.
So Canada will count the emissions coming from domestic flights. So those show up in our inventory. But the emissions of a Canadian airplane traveling to India, who counts those? That's the question.
If the plane is flying from Halifax to Vancouver, it counts. If it's flying from Vancouver to Tokyo, it doesn't count.
It doesn't count in Canada's inventory.
Well,
so where does it count?
Does it count in Tokyo's when it lands?
No. So
it doesn't count, period.
So for this sort of thing, there is the International Association of, an acronym breakdown that is failing me. The International Civil, ICAO. It will come to me, the breakdown. Anyway, there is an international body that assesses emissions in the international aviation world. But it's interesting, right? Because there's this body and they're meant to be the kind of like international institution for the airline industries. But they're not a country. So they don't enter into the negotiations of the UNFCCC. So they're kind of this like subsidiary functionary body that has their own set of negotiations happening. So countries are signatories to ICAO, and they come together under ICAO to negotiate what emissions reductions goals and protocols should exist for the international aviation sector within that body. And then there's a kind of attempt to bring that work into the framework of the UNFCCC. Same goes for international shipping. So there's the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, that does that work as well. And I actually don't know, and I don't think, I'm sure I would know if there was a similar organization for military. activities, and there isn't to my knowledge. So yeah, so that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Some homework for us.
Yeah, sounds like we need a whole lot of a whole army full of people doing recordings and countings.
Totally.
Maybe there are that many people out there doing. Do you feel that the actual research on what is going on, the counting, is adequate? That you can be confident that you know that they tell us what's really happening in the world?
Wow. What an existential crisis question. So I think that there is some, I don't think, I know there is some incredible science happening on these issues in the world. And there are really reliable models being used to trace emissions. And there is really quite precise technology available to account for emissions. The caveat is that emissions accounting happens at a very wide diversity of scales in a huge range of settings, right? And the rules for it differ from country to country, and the capacity to keep track of and regulate it differ from country to country. So if we take the case of Canada, great science happening on climate change and emissions charting here, pretty amazing access to technology. The rules we have for accounting actually involve quite a lot of self-reporting of emissions from large industrial facilities. And whether they're reporting accurately depends on the capacity of the Canadian government to regulate their reporting and follow up on that regulation. The Canadian government happens to have fairly good capacity to do that, but the ways in which that capacity gets deployed differs according to the whims, or maybe I should say priorities, of the government of the day. Mm-hmm. So, the accounting consistency and accounting rules actually changes and fluctuates pretty regularly, even in a country like Canada that's like wealthy and has a lot of capacity behind it. Imagine, the ways in which that can fluctuate and change in countries that are struggling with such a diversity of things that perhaps they don't have the same capacity. Like, think about that happening in Iraq. Mm-hmm. So, so the science is there, the technology is there, but as is always the case in our worlds, I'm sure it's the same in your worlds. It's really about political capacity and political will.
Yeah, but there's another question sort of related, and that is, apart from the counting problem, I'm just not sure that the science itself always is certain enough to make anything very predictable. I'm thinking, for example, of the clathrates in the ocean and the methane in the Arctic and so on. And I remember reading things about bubbles and plumes of methane coming up in the East Siberian Sea. So, just huge miles and miles of gas emissions coming up out of the ocean. And now the question is, how much stuff is down there, and how long is it going to take to melt? And when it does melt, we know that, if it really gets out, it's game over. How long do we have? And the estimates that I have seen vary all over the map, from any minute now to 150 years. Don't worry, kind of thing. And so, a lot of things like the how much carbon can the oceans absorb before everything dies, things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, can you sleep at night
I struggle sometimes, to be honest with you. But okay, so I have a background in science. Do you have a background in science and all?
No, I have a background in sociology, and that doesn't qualify me for anything useful.
I disagree. I love sociology. I also have a background in anthropology, and I'm passionate about that discipline. But I studied biology for many, many years, and spent a lot of my life thinking that I would be a full-time scientist at some point. And here's what I love about science. I love the fact that true science begins with the admission that you don't know anything. And mostly real science is not about talking about what you know. It's about asking why and admitting when you don't know. That is why I passionately love science. It is perhaps one of the unfortunate side effects or ramifications of the fact that we use science to make policy decisions, that we are then tempted to squeeze science into an accuracy box that it doesn't belong in. So we want science to tell us exactly what's going to happen and when. And if it's not right, if it's not exactly right in its predictions, we throw it all out the window. When in actuality, the science gives us a range of possibilities. And it is our responsibility to, using the precautionary principle, choose the most reasonable behavior to respond to that range of possibilities. So it's true that the science of a melting Arctic and what the implications of that are for methane release, and what the methane release might mean for accelerated warming, because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's true that the range of years that we've been given for that potential is huge. Also, the most recent assessment report from the IPCC, this is amazing. It gives us this range of potential sea level rise out until 2100. It says sea levels will rise from anywhere between 500 meters to something like 6,000 meters. Like, it's just like a giant range.
And that makes sense to me. The sea level doesn't range 500 meters. I mean, sea level, we're talking about a few feet, right?
Yeah. Yes, feet. Sorry.
Oh, 500 feet.
So sea levels will rise from 5 feet to 100 feet within the next 80 years. So the range is just huge. That's not inaccurate.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
From the assessment report, but it's just a snapshot of the kind of ways in which science is able to say, we know. So, what we're able to say for sure, sea levels are rising. What we're able to say for sure, there are huge methane stores trapped under permafrost in the tundra that will be released at some point during the melting. And so it's then our responsibility, and it's government's responsibility as decision makers, and it's our responsibility to hold government and industry to account within those decisions, using the information we have to respond as reasonably as possible, given that range of possibility. And so I think that this instinct or default to, as soon as the science seems somewhat unpredictable or inconsistent, throw it out and say it's completely wrong, is actually something that has been cultivated by incumbent interests who have hitched their ride on questioning that science and using every single opportunity and perceived inconsistency to suggest that we shouldn't be making reasonable choices and acting as responsibly as possible given what it is we know.
Okay, got it. That makes sense to me. Yeah, I could see it that way. Now let me throw a last one at you, because this is one that does keep me awake at night, because it's something nobody else seems to know anything about. I've read, and I go around proselytizing people to read the Drawdown book, the American book. And I think it was a huge contribution. And the most astounding thing was the number one item, the most effective thing, most important thing that could be done to reduce global warming would be something about refrigeration. And the people doing the research themselves were astonished to find this out. And I saw one estimate that the emission of the gases, the coolant gases in refrigerators and air conditioners is sufficient to make 1 full degree of difference in global temperature. Mm-hmm. That is a huge, huge amount. Mm-hmm. I mention this everywhere I go in parties and places, and nobody ever has heard about it.
Yeah.
Now, it would seem to me that there was a meeting in Kigali in Rwanda.
Yeah, you know about it.
Yeah. And that's good, but it seems that it's a plan for future, the construction of future air conditioners and changing to a different kind of coolant that will take place over a period of time. What worries me is the amount of stuff that's already out there in refrigerators that are going to be taken out to the city dump and left to leak. Mm-hmm. I wonder, how can we get this done? Seems to me that every city of any size should have a place where there are trained specialists who can extract the gas from used, worn out refrigerators and air conditioners and put it in a safe place and do something to it. And I would say we ought to have a law starting tomorrow that every new refrigerator that's delivered to somebody's home or air conditioner, the same guy should take away the old one and take it to this particular reprocessing place. Mm-hmm. Now, I haven't heard anybody make that kind of policy proposal. Mm-hmm. But how would you get a thing like that into the public discourse? I think if people don't know about it, they're not going to make any demands for it. But I really think 1 full degree of difference in the Earth's temperature because refrigerators, that's something we can do something about. I don't know about the methane in the Arctic. I can't do much about that. But I can really lobby to get somebody to take away old refrigerators and stuff out of them. What do you think?
Yeah, so that issue was originally addressed in something called the Montreal Protocol, which phased out some really destructive greenhouse gas chemicals from air conditioning and refrigeration units a couple decades ago. And then the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol has instituted a new set of commitments from countries around the phase out of this new set of chemicals. I mean, incidentally, Montreal Protocol phased out some, and so companies started using these new chemicals. Turns out these new chemicals also are greenhouse gases.
The first ones do bad things to the ozone,
yeah,
and these do worse things to greenhouse gas. Yeah,
exactly. So the Kigali Amendment, if implemented, will help reduce or mitigate about 0.5 degree of warming, which is great. But the way you do the thing that you're talking about doing, it's been done, is you develop in Canada a provincial body that is charged with improving energy efficiency in homes and communities across the province or territory. And you pay that body to remove those inefficient or less efficient refrigeration air cooling units and replace them with more efficient ones that have a rebate so that people can afford them. and add up to longer term savings so that people find them an attractive investment. And then you have a centralized body that does that work of recycling things properly. And there are organizations like that across Canada that consistently are under supported. So that's how you do it. That's the model. Yeah.
Oh, now, wait a minute. I thought that those things where you get a rebate for changing your refrigerator, that was just to put in more efficient, maybe use less.
More energy efficient, yeah.
But that does it also cover the quality of the coolants?
So not necessarily right now, but so in a place that like Efficiency in Nova Scotia, which has some of those kinds of programs in place to help homeowners and community members make those changes, you could easily add on to their mandate the replacement with units that fall under the Kigali Agreement and fit those metrics.
Okay, how do we do that? I want to sign up for some sort of committee.
Yeah. So this is actually another area where Canada's shown some leadership recently. So Canada obviously has some level of ownership over the Montreal Protocol and fought really hard for the Kigali Amendment and its ratification. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. If you want to start a campaign that describes how Canada can best implement the Kigali Amendment here at home, I'm with you. Let's do it.
All right. Okay. We've got a new team. Anybody else want to join our team? Catherine and I are now a committee of two. And I've had such a good time talking to you, Catherine. I hate to tell you the truth, which is that our time is up and we're 3 minutes in overtime.
Oh, wow. Overtime. Okay. That was a good combo.
Minute of this, and I think it's very informative and other people will find it too.
Yes.
So have a good time in Halifax and give those guys our blessings and our urgings for them to carry forward with this great cause. Okay?
I will indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Metta. Same to you. Bye-bye.